Now that we have an idea of how to draw the big shapes of architecture, the next step is to break down the big shapes into smaller shapes. In this lesson, you'll learn an easy approach to drawing windows and doors, the basics of sketching columns, and the anatomy of a true arch. So let's start by heading to Amsterdam. Here's a photo of a beautiful storefront along a pedestrian street in lovely Amsterdam. And if I'm going to sit down and try and do a sketch of this, I'm going to actually, again, start with big shapes. So I'm going to ignore the bicycles, all the stuff that actually makes it a little fun, and really just look at the big shapes. And what I first look for are squares. So I sit down, I hold up my pencil, and I measure an edge, a vertical edge, and which would probably be this edge right about here, because that gives me a lot of information. Then I drop my pencil to get the width. So I'm looking for proportions, relationship of height to width. And if I do that, I can see we get something pretty close to a square right about here. So there's my first big shape. That's probably the most important one. I also get another big shape over here on the left with the second set of windows. And I have a ground line where the wall meets the ground. Super important to sketching. All right, so big shapes are in. What's the next step? I'm going to try and find my vanishing point and my eye level line. And to do that, I'm going to look for lines that are receding away from me. Now we're mostly looking at this view in elevation. I'm looking straight on at this wall. So where are we going to find a little bit of perspective? Well, there are a couple of little places we can look for. One would be right here in the corner of this doorway. If I extend that line, now I actually need to find another one. Let's go to the paving. Look at the paving, which is perpendicular, like my line of sight, to the face of the building. I can use this paving to help me find my vanishing point. And of course, the ground is a little uneven, so if we have a little wobbling, that's okay. So this paving is telling me my vanishing point directly in front of me is right about there. And I'm going to use that point to draw all kinds of little things that show depth, like the corner of that window, same for this little corner here. So there's not a lot of depth, but what little depth we have is very important. So we've now got the vanishing point. That means my eye level line was right through here, and my head, when I stopped to take this picture, was right about in here. So now we have the tools we need to do this as a sketch. So let's try a sketch. So now that I've found the big shapes in the photo, located my eye level line and my vanishing point, I can use those three things to start my sketch. So let's get this going. The first thing I'm going to do is transfer that first square, and I'm going to start with that first edge that I first measured and drew on the photo. And I get a line about like this. Remember, the first line that I make is the one that establishes the size of the sketch. So now I need to draw something like a square where the height and the width are roughly the same. Now I can put in this other shape, which is kind of over here. And I'm looking at the relationship of this to this. It comes up, pops up to about here. Then I'm going to get another window in here. And then if I need to check my proportions, check my measurements while I'm in the process of sketching, I just hold my pencil up again, line up the edge, and measure all through my sketching process if I need to. Now let's get that ground line in. And I guess we could add just a little bit of line work up here. Okay, we have the big shapes in. Now let's spot the eye level and vanishing point. When I'm sketching on location, I will pin my vanishing point on something in my view. In this case, there happens to be a nice little yellow plate right by my vanishing point. So that's going to help me reference that as I sketch. And the vanishing point looks to be, it's a little less than halfway up that square, so maybe right about here. And I'm going to draw my eye level line in all the way across my sketch. So we now have all the tools we need to complete the sketch. We can break these big shapes down into smaller shapes to get the windows. I'm going to add the top to this window here. And let's start by adding a little depth. And we're going to use the vanishing point for that. So there's a little bit of a recess to the window here and here. You know, most windows aren't right on the front face of the building. They're actually recessed a little bit into the wall. So it's important to show that depth in your sketch because it adds a really good sense of reality, adds a little more interest to your sketch. So now we add a little bit of depth there. We can do the same here. I can add this little bit of a partial column or a pilaster, the bottom of the window here. And notice I'm showing multiple lines every time I want to show the edge of a window because it just adds a little bit more of a sense of reality. I'm going to use the vanishing point for a little depth here. Carry that volume down a little here. And let's add this doorway in here. There's the front of the door. Here's this other piece. Again, we're going to use that vanishing point to get a little depth into our image. All right, now let's look at how to break down these big shapes into the smaller shapes. I'm looking at the window on the left and it's divided into 5 panes vertically. So 5 panes tall, so I can kind of draw some light guidelines in, divide this roughly into 5 units. I can adjust as needed as I go because these are really light lines. And then it's divided vertically into 3 sections. So I can just kind of eyeball that as well. My proportions look a little bit off, so I'm just going to adjust. Can add some more lines in here. So it's important when you draw a window mullion or muntin or any building material really to show some thickness. So if I'm going to draw this window, I don't really want to show it as a single line. I need to show it as at least a double line and sometimes 3 lines if you really want to show some depth. So if you like to show detail and draw slowly, then you're going to need to add more lines to show a sense of reality to the depth of the materials. All right, let's jump to this window really fast, and I'm just going to quickly add this bit up here, in here. You notice how I use my triangle really helps me to draw straight lines really quickly. And then there's a little bit in this doorway. I'm still not drawing any detail in. I'm really just breaking those big shapes down into smaller shapes. All right. So one way to show that the windows are actually made of glass is to show some transparency in these windows. So let's add a little bit of information. Over here we see shelves with cheese on them. And I can just show shapes. It doesn't have to be anything in particular, just to show that something's back there. And I can jump over here. There are lots of bowls and things. Big plates, dishes. I can even sort of lightly suggest a person. I'll often add a person for scale. It's just helpful to the sketch. And stick that door in. And even though my proportions might not be exactly right, they're close enough. I'm going to add a little bit here, just so that it feathers out a bit. So now let's add a little bit of watercolor to these windows. Now when I paint, I usually tilt my paper quite a bit. And it really is helpful because it lets the water and the pigment sort of sink to the bottom. You let gravity work for you. And it just keeps backwash from happening, and it has a really nice effect to the watercolor. So usually when I'm painting windows, I'll start with a little bit of yellow at the bottom for warmth, because that's usually where some of the activity is behind the window. All right, so I just add a little bit of yellow. This happens to be a little new gamboge and a little yellow ochre. And I can even add a little bit of orange to it to warm it up a bit. And I'm not even really painting exactly what I'm seeing, just really adding it for effect. Next, I will add a blue or a gray to darken the windows. And I can start painting these openings. And you want to paint right to the corner, right into the edges. Even if you overlap with the pencil work a little bit, that's okay, but it's important to get each corner and edge clear. Then I'll add a little bit of manganese blue because it's a good indication of reflecting sky, and it just adds a little bit of brightness to the glass. I let it blend a little there. And then I'll do the same thing over here with these other windows. Let's get it a little darker. And where I leave a little bit of the white of the paper coming through, it starts to read like a reflection of something in the window, reflection of light, so it's a nice effect. So there, that's pretty much how I would draw windows and paint them. When it comes to drawing multiple windows in a building facade, it's really important to notice that there are relationships between these openings, both vertically and horizontally. Let's take a look at an image of the Maurits house in The Hague, Holland. So as I look at this facade, of course I'm going to notice my big shapes. And within that big shape, I can draw some guidelines to help me draw in these windows. So here, they connect horizontally along the bases. They have a relationship at the top of the windows, and then same down here. So in my sketch, I will draw that as very light guidelines. I won't erase them, just draw them in. Then they also have relationships vertically. So once I have those guidelines in, it's so much easier to actually draw the windows. And in images like this, I love to just make tiny little black windows and then add a layer of paint over them to give it a little bit more depth. And I leave the window mullions white. So let's take a look at the finished sketch of Maurits' house. So here it is, and you can see the windows all align horizontally and they align vertically. I can even still see the little bit of the guidelines that I drew when I was making this sketch to help me locate the windows accurately. And then you'll see that I darkened in each window pane, just the pane, with a little black pencil, and then I went over it with some watercolor to fix it and add some depth. So now we're sitting in Rome, and this is the building across the street while I was sitting and having breakfast. I decided to do a sketch of this. This is a two-point perspective, so it's going to have a vanishing point on the left and a vanishing point on the right. So we can start by the top of this. We have a vanishing point to the left, way out of the image, and a vanishing point on the right, somewhere down here. If we extend these lines, we can find it. So that's about the height of me sitting. There's my vanishing point, and here's my eye level line going across. So then we can draw that in. Notice it's flatter, closer to the eye level line. And then we have the vertical at the corner, which is a really important line to show when we're sketching for understanding how to construct our sketch, and the ground line. Okay, so in drawing multiple windows on a facade, it's really useful to use guidelines again. We can show the horizontal guidelines at the top and the bottom of each of these windows. And again, you're going to draw these in very lightly. Notice how they get flatter as they get closer to the eye level line and lower in the image. And then I can draw vertical guidelines very lightly as well, because this helps me with the relationship of all these windows. Okay, so we have the windows on that face. Let's take a look at what happens when it rounds the corner to the other side. Now we're going to use the vanishing point on our page. So when the guideline hits that corner, it's going to recede in perspective. So there's the bottom of the top windows, there's the top of the windows. I can draw in a guideline for the next row of windows and pick up the guideline at the corner here and bring it down in perspective, pick up the guideline there and bring it down in perspective. And then I can add some verticals. And I won't really, and this is kind of a thick line, but I won't really count every window. I just kind of eyeball them as they go back. But establishing that grid very quickly and very lightly helps me to draw the building's windows in accurately in perspective. So here's my completed sketch for my breakfast in Rome. I drew in the basic shapes first in perspective using the 2 vanishing points, even though they're off my page. And then I drew in the very light guidelines vertically and horizontally. And you can actually still, if you look very closely, you can see the guidelines still in the sketch. And then once those guidelines hit that corner, they turn in perspective and use the vanishing point on the right. They make drawing windows so much easier and so much more accurate. So that is how I like to draw windows. What if an architect wants to make a larger opening in a wall? Well, this is where you will often find columns. So let's go to some of the most famous columns in the world, the front face of the Pantheon in Rome. The top of the column is called the Capitol. The body of the column is called the body or the shaft. And then it hits the ground at a base, which is usually a little wider. And the base can often be round, or it can often be square with a bit of a side there. So let's try drawing some columns in a sketchbook. Now you might think that the easiest way to draw columns would be to start with one and then to kind of add the next and add the next and add the next. That is not what I would recommend you do because it's really hard to control the size on your paper. It's really hard to control the proportions. So of course I'm going to suggest instead that you start with a big shape. So here's the face of the Pantheon. And I've of course measured the proportions, looked for squares with my pencil. Then I would take this and divide it up into the number of columns I see. And in the front of the Pantheon there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 columns. So I draw light guidelines for each of those columns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Oh, look, I get to add it, make it a little longer. 8. I can always correct the proportions as I'm sketching. And then once I have that shape, I can go back in and add some of the details in the anatomy of the column. So I'm going to get the capital in here. And the capital is really interesting because it often indicates the style or the date of the building. And then often there's a taper to the body. It's a little narrower at the top and a little wider at the bottom. But if I'm doing a quick sketch, I usually just ignore that and draw the straight sides. But if you really want to do a detailed sketch, show a little bit of the taper or the slight curve that you sometimes find. And then of course there's the base. And the side of the base can be in perspective. And then I would start to add that same information on each of these blocked out columns. So let's take a look at what happens when we draw columns in perspective. Now we're looking at some columns in Paris. So similar to the Pantheon, this portion is a frontal view where we get these shapes. But what happens in perspective? Well, let's find the vanishing point by extending these lines. And the base here. So my vanishing point is roughly here. All right, I'm going to take the guidelines that I draw here for the top of the column, the bottom of the column. They hit the corner, and then they're going to come forward in perspective. But really, the main takeaway here is to look at these columns on the left in perspective. Here, they're taller and wider, and then as they get farther away from us, those lines get shorter and closer together. And it's really, really important to show both the height and the space in between the columns diminishing more and more as the columns get further away from us. That's really the takeaway from this image. And here's a really quick sketch that I did of some columns outside of London in Greenwich by architect Christopher Wren. And I didn't even show any of the detail of the columns. It's really all about the beautiful rhythm, the elegant rhythm of columns to the spaces in between them. Columns are really great to draw, and they're important to the anatomy of architecture. Now let's take a look at another type of opening in a wall, an arch. I love talking about arches. It's one of my favorite things to teach because I so often see people do this. And that is not an arch, that is a distorted horseshoe. So let's take a look at what a real arch looks like. The anatomy of an arch. An arch typically has straight vertical sides, like true verticals, up and down. They hit the ground. Then the upper portion is at what we call a spring line, and you'll see why in a moment. There's often a lot of decoration at the spring line. You'll see decorative moldings and things. And then from the spring line, we get a curve. The curve is symmetrical. The whole thing, actually, the entire arch is symmetrical about a center, so I will often draw in a very light center line to make sure that it's not a lopsided arch, because then it would actually collapse. Literally collapse. So the portion above the spring line is some form of a circle. Roman arches have very round half circles. Medieval arches are often pointed. And then there's a keystone right here, the last piece to go in, that marks the center of the arch. Now let's take a look at how to draw arches. So now we're in Venice sketching arches. The first thing I do is start with the big shapes, of course. So I'm going to draw a rectangle here, here at the corner, the ground line, and at the top of the arch, and probably up here as well. It's super important to look at the shape underneath the spring line, and I do that by measuring the height to the width with my pencil when I'm sketching on location. Here, it happens to be pretty much a square in shape, but you can also find arches that have tall rectangles or wide rectangles for that shape underneath the arch. That's a common mistake that a lot of people make, so be sure you measure the proportions accurately and get the shape underneath the spring line correct. So then we would draw in the entire circle. That's a little rough, but I think you get the idea. And then in perspective, how are we going to show these arches on the right-hand side of our image? Well, we need to find the vanishing point. So let's extend these lines and see where they converge. There's our vanishing point. Here's the eye level line. So same thing on this side. We're going to use the guidelines that hit the corner and then come toward us in perspective. Draw in each bay, and when I'm sketching live, I just really approximate it. I can kind of measure it with my pencil, but I'm not really being too careful about it. And then what happens to a circle in perspective? It becomes an ellipse. So now this form that we saw on the other side, we can bring this guideline around in perspective to help us too, becomes an ellipse. And if you draw lightly the entire ellipse, it becomes much easier to draw an accurate arch. And then of course there's the depth, because the material of that wall has some thickness. So this is the technique that I use for sketching arches. Now let's take a look at how to sketch these arches on paper. And of course, first I'm going to start with the big shapes. So I start with a corner. Then let's get that square in underneath the spring line of the arch. Then I can measure up, use my pencil to measure how high the arch will go. Now that I have some big shapes in, I'm going to find my vanishing point and eye level line. And now I can use that vanishing point to help me pull the perspective forward. And now I can start to add some more information about the arches, both the straight-on ones and the ones that we see vanishing in perspective. Now let's add a little bit of depth to these walls. Now we have some quickly sketched arches in perspective. And here's a sketch that I did this past summer in a small church in Italy. Of course, beautiful arches, even some columns at the bases of the arches. I love sketching arches. They soar above your head. They frame views so perfectly. The rhythm of them is so nice. And you can see in the sketch, there's my vanishing point, my eye level line. I'm actually using those guidelines to generate this sketch, the foundational lines of this sketch. For homework, it'd be great if you could go out and sketch a window, column, or arch somewhere near where you live and apply some of the principles that we learned in this lesson. In the next lesson, we'll look at how to add a sense of materials to the architecture. See you soon.